Next, we're going to look at the spine setup. Again, I've already got some controllers in place and a spine chain or joint chain, which is essentially just a few bones, relatively evenly spaced, and the ones from here to here represent the spine, and this one is the neck, this one is the head, this is the top of the head. For the controllers, we've got a series of 1, 2, 3, 5. We've got a master upper body controller. We've got two kind of FK style rotation controllers that we'd use to rotate the waist or the hip, or sorry, the upper body in an FK fashion. We've got a secondary or lower spine controller, which also doubles as a contrapposto or a hip pelvis manipulator. And then we've got a master controller, which essentially is going to be the control for everything in the upper body. And again, right now, these are all separate. They're the same as the foot. They're all zeroed out. And just going to triple check them. So they are all zeroed out, and they're ready to go essentially. So now we may change some pivots and things along the way, but we'll just start with them here and see how it goes. Now, just so for the time being, I'm going to hide the controls. So I'm going to hide the torso control layer. I'm just going to leave the spine joint layer visible. And just like I did before, I'm going to show, so I'm going to scroll down here, shift click on the hip to expose the entire spine chain, and I'm going to display my current pivots. So transform display, local rotation axes, and just like they were before, they are all over the place. So I'm going to use the same tools I did previously to see what I get, and much like before, it kind of helps but doesn't. So we need to make some changes here. So I'm going to open up the skeleton, open up the orient options, and I'm going to reset them back to the default settings. Now I still want to achieve the same type of relationship. So what I've switched, and you can try different combinations and see what you get. So for example, right now I've got X, Z, and Z. So it's the same setting as I used last time, where the Z axis is facing forward. For a spine, its dominant axis really is bending forward. And you can see as it is, it's kind of doing strange things. But when I rotate it in Y, which is the current forward axis, it's a negative value. Now the reason why it's acting weird right now is because my end joint is the last one selected. The gizmo is going to align itself to that one, and you can see that one does not match the others. So just like I did before, the end joint, if you want to match the end joint to the previous one in the chain or its parent, just select it, go into the attribute editor, and zero out both rotation axes, which chances are it's already going to be 0, and joint orient. So I'm going to 0 that. And what it does is it will match the rotation or the orientation to its the previous joint in the chain, which is what I want. So now when I rotate it, there we go, I get values that make sense. Problem is, my rotate value for Y, which is what's now rotating it, bending it forward and backwards, the dominant direction is definitely forward, and it's negative. So maybe what I'll do this time is I'll try a different orientation. Maybe I'll try Oops, wrong button. Y forward, pointing along the z-axis, and I'm going to have to reorient that child joint again. They never play nice when it comes to orientation. They always get left behind because orientation is based on a chain, and because it's the last one in the chain, it doesn't get a value. So now let's see what I get. Now this is actually better. So now when I rotate forward, you can see I get a positive value in Z as opposed to the negative value that I was getting previously. So I think that's a better starting point in this situation. So I've got Y as my secondary axis, and I'm getting Y to point down the positive Z axis. So it should look like this once you've got it set up. And again, when I rotate it forward, I'm selecting all the joints together and rotating them in the same direction. They should all go in the same direction, which they definitely are. And again, ideally, it'd be nice if the forward direction was a positive number, and you can see that's the case. So I'm going to stick with that as my joint orientation for the spine. And I'm going to close that. And much like the legs, now we have to worry about giving it the next layer of control. Now, temporarily, while I'm working on this, I'm actually going to unparent the neck. I'm going to work. So I'm going to select the neck. I'm going to hit Shift P. And you can see they're no longer connected. The reason for that is I like to create the system separately, and really the spine is kind of its own. It has a different type of control than the neck would in the end. So if you isolate them, give them each their own control independently, and then once you've got that working properly, connect that back into the system. To me, it's a little bit more foolproof way to work, and you won't run into as many problems as if you try to do the two independent control systems while they were still connected. Another thing I'm going to do is turn off visually the orientation. I don't need to see that anymore, so I'm going to go into my display, transform, and turn off local rotation axes, and do the same thing for my neck chain, which is where? There it is. Just going to shift click to open that up, select all the bones, and turn that off as well, so it looks a little bit easier to see. So first things first, we'll deal with the spine on its own first. So for that, we're going to use a IK handle just like we did for the feet or for the legs, but a different type of IK. When you've got a chain of objects like we do here, you can create what's called a spline IK to give you a control curve that essentially automatically matches itself to your selection and allows you to control the shape of that group of objects based on the shape of a curve. And for a spine, that's a great way to, it's almost like the spinal cord in a sense. It kind of visually comes up in the center of the spinal chain. So for that one, we'll select the root. You always go from the root, which is the hips up. And I'm going to select my skeleton, create IK spline handle tool. So this is specifically for chains of joints, spines, tails, and an antenna on a car, maybe anything that was long and flexible would work. And I'm going to start at the base, and again, in this case, you're going to click on the end bone of the spine, which is this one up here. And what should happen, it should draw a line through the spine, which can be tough to select, but if you come over to our outliner here on the bottom, you should see IK handle 1 and curve 5. So the curve is the curve here, it's the green line in the middle of the spine, and the IK handle is the control object that allows you to manipulate that. So let's label each of those. So for IK handle 1, I'm going to call that one spline or spine underscore IK handle. And for curve 5, I'm going to call that one spine underscore CTL for control underscore CRV for curve. So spine control curve. So with that selected, oops, labeled the wrong node. I'm going to copy and paste that over here. Actually going to undo that. Just going to take it back a couple of steps to make sure I label the right node, because I don't want to get confused later. There we go. Because if you label the transform node, it'll automatically relabel the shape node, but if you do it the other way around, it doesn't. So it's smarter to label the transform node, not the shape node. So sometimes depending on what you have selected, it's easy to mistake that. So I just undid it and labeled the correct one. So with that selected, that curve, if I right click in the viewport, I can activate the control vertex or control vertices of that curve, which they're kind of hard to see, but they will show up at various points along the curve. By default, there should be 4 of them. And yeah, if I move one of them, what I'm doing is I'm changing the shape of that curve or that spline, which in turn is changing the shape of the spine. But as it is right now, the only way to control that is by, again, right clicking, going into control vertex mode, selecting those little tiny vertices that you can barely see, and changing them. It's, again, just like it was for the IK handles in the previous example, it's just not a user-friendly way to work for an animator. So we need to give this a layer of control as well. So we need to give control of this curve over to something that's easier to work with and easier to select. So there's a number of different types of objects we could use. In this case specifically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate and reuse the joints. I could use locators, I could use other objects. I've got options, but to keep it simple and reuse information I already have that I know is oriented properly, if I duplicate these joints, I know they're going to be clean because I'm duplicating for something that I've already set up, and I'm just going to reuse them for a different purpose. So I'm going to go back to object mode here so that the curve is green instead of blue. I'm going to select the spine and I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to duplicate the entire chain. So I'm going to hit Control D, and what that should do is create a copy of all those nodes, including some information I don't need. So for example, I've got another IK effector. I don't need that. I'm going to delete it. In the end, all I truly need is the hip 1 and the duplicate of spine 02, which is the end here. So I'm going to unparent that from the chain. So I'm going to select spine 02, hit Shift P, so it's no longer part of the hierarchy, and I'm going to select spine 1 through spine 2 in the chain that you've got here, and I'm going to delete all of those. So what I'm left with is hip 1, a copy of hip 1, and then a copy of the end bone. So these 2 bones are all I truly need. Because right now we've got 4 control points that control that to spine. If I could give influence over to just these 2 bones, that's a lot simpler scenario and a little bit more, again, higher level and a little bit more user friendly. So I'm going to label these. So for the hip 1, I'm going to name it, again, making sure I'm on the transform node for the joint. I'm going to call that one lower underscore spine underscore CTL. And then the upper one, I'm going to call that one upper underscore spine. Actually, instead of spine, I'm going to call those curve, because they're specifically controlling the curve itself. So lower curve control and upper curve control. So now I actually need to give them some influence over the curve, which they currently don't have. So I'm going to select both of them and the spine curve itself, and we're going to go into our rigging menu and go to skin, bind skin, options, and it's going to reset that to the default settings, and I'm just going to set the max influences to 2 because I've only got 2 bones that I'm actually skinning, and everything else I'm just going to leave at the default. Once that's done, if I select either one of those joints and move them, because they've been skinned to the curve, or sorry, the curve has been skinned to them, the curve is now kind of a slave to those bones and will automatically follow along for the ride, which again gives me a much easier way to manipulate that spine shape than I originally had, which was again to go into component mode and grab the vertices directly. So that's doing exactly what I want it to. So just like the leg, now we've got this extra control, but still it's a lot harder to select these controllers than it would be to select a master controller. So if I bring back my torso control layer, I've created this controller and this controller to essentially be the masters for those 2 points. Now I do want to make sure the pivots for those objects are in a sensible place, and ultimately it would be smartest to put them at the pivot point of the objects that they're controlling. So right now it's nowhere near that. The pivot for this object is way up here. The pivot for my pelvis is way down here, and I want to center that on that node. So just like I did with the others, I'm going to hit the insert key to activate pivot mode, and I'm going to use my point snap, which is this button right here, or the hotkey for that is hold down the V key, and I'm going to, with the V key depressed, I'm going to middle mouse click and drag on the object I want to snap the pivot to, and I'm going to hit insert to lock it down. I'm going to do the same thing for this one. Insert, hold down V for point snap, and then middle mouse click and drag at the spine joint that I want to pivot it from, and once again hit insert. So now when I pivot from those points, nothing happens, but when I move them in IK type relationship, oh, still nothing happens because I haven't given them control yet. So that's the next step. So we've got them lined or aligned, so now we need to give them influence over those, the current influencing objects, which are those 2 bones. So obviously the upper is going to be connected to my torso control, so I'm going to select the torso control first, control click my upper control joint, and I'm going to use another constraint to connect these. I'm going to use what's called a parent constraint. So now if I move that controller, the upper control joint should come along for the ride. I just actually had a thought too. I've got them lower curve control. I should call it add underscore JNT so I know that it's a joint and not a controller. That way I won't get confused later. Again, naming is always very important. So now I did the same setup for this, for the bottom. I select the pelvis control, control click my lower curve control joint, and parent constrain it. So now again I have the ability to move the spine with that lower control. Now that I've got that done, by the way, it's probably safe to graph these back in, but I'm still not going to do it quite yet because in a separate video we're going to set up the controllers for the neck, and I'll connect it afterwards, but I could do it now if I wanted to and it would still be fine. So what we've got now is a bit of a hybrid, or the basis of a hybrid setup. We've got an IK manipulator working to create the current shape of the spine. However, as it is, we don't have the ability to change the length. You can see if I stretch it out, which I do have the ability to do, the joints don't change. They're not able to change their length to match that curve. So we're going to deal with that soon. But before we get there, let's go ahead and kind of finish off this hierarchy that we've got happening here. So, for example, we want to create a daisy chain here to kind of give us the ability to rotate these controllers and kind of drag along the upper controller for the ride to give us an FK style manipulation. And this one's really simple. We just need to start at the top with our torso control and then shift click our torso mid control, FK torso mid control, and parent it. So just hit P, which gives us the ability to do this, and you can see already now I've got the ability to arch the back and bring the shoulders along, which again gives us a very FK style manipulation. And we're just going to daisy chain that down to the next one. So we're going to take torso mid control and parent that to FK torso low control. So now we've got 3 different levels of control over this spine object. Now the next one, this torso low control, we're actually going to parent this to the master control, this outer one right here. Now the reason that is, some people might say, why not link it to our pelvis? Reason being, we want the pelvis to be independent. We want the ability to rotate the pelvis, to adjust the angle of the pelvis independently of everything else. As soon as I connect this controller to that pelvis, I lose the ability to do that. The pelvis would then pull all this along for the ride. So the master controller can take that job. So if I now rotate from the master controller, you can see that drags everything along for the ride. But I still have the ability to move the pelvis independently. So what I will do to kind of finish this off hierarchy wise is connect my pelvis controller also and parent that to the master. So I've got master, just like the foot master I had earlier, which rotates everything. I've got pelvis, which is pelvis down only, and then these I've got the ability to do an arch spine based on an FK type rotation. Now for these, by the way, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to also manipulate their pivots so they're aligned with existing bones. If you wanted to do that, again, insert key, snap it to a bone that's already in the system, insert key, point snap it to a bone just like we did earlier, and now when we rotate, it's going to pivot from the relative position of those joints. Just a little bit cleaner. And once again, I'm undoing those movements, but because of the way I've set these up, if I just come over here to the channel box and zero out any rotations, that will go back to the default position. So I'm going to stop this video here. So we've essentially created a basic IK spine control, created a few control objects, and connected them together in a hierarchy that allows us to get a hybrid of both IK and FK control within the same control network. In the next video we'll focus more on the technical side of adding a stretch and squash value and also twist to this setup, so we can get a little bit more finite control over the some of those kind of higher level attributes.